Chapter 1 Conspiracy in the Woods. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Sun Glory Kingdom. Cloudy Moon City. Green peaks loomed, hidden behind surrounding clouds. Dense tall trees covered the high slopes as they swayed under the wind. The mountainous woods was seemingly tranquil and quiet on this dawn. However, deep within the remote and desolate woods, a cruel and bloodied scene was unfolding at that very moment. A girl dressed in fine satin silks was being held down in a kneeling position with her arm twisted behind her back by two burly men. Her head hung low, barely conscious, her messed up hair covering over her face quickly getting soaked by the blood gushing out from her face. The bright red blood dripped drop by drop off the ends of the hair onto the ground, slowly seeping into the earth. The badly weakened young girl gritted her teeth to raise her head when she heard footsteps approaching, revealing a blood-covered face. That was a face that had been badly disfigured, the flesh on the face slashed open by blades, looking a complete gory mess, a shockingly terrifying sight to behold. "Who are you? Why do you want to harm me?" The young girl's voice was extremely weak, as it came out of her throat barely a whisper. She resisted strongly against blacking out from the excessive loss of blood as she focused her gaze on the face before her, shielded by a light gauze veil, and the shapely body of a beautiful lady. The veiled lady wore a dress of light blue, the color of cloudy skies, with tassels of the same color hanging down softly from the hip, swishing gracefully in tandem with the lady's light steps. The lady's steps stopped before the young girl who was held down to kneel on the ground. The lady glared down at the disfigured young girl, her beautiful eyes curved into two crescents as she smiled and said, "I am Feng Qinggu, the eldest young miss of the National Defense Mansion, daughter of the formidable General Feng Shao. The Feng family's young miss, the future inheritor of the Feng family, and also, the fiancé to the proud son of the heavens, the third Duke of the Sun Glory country." The familiar-sounding voice and the words the lady in front of her said, made the young girl open her eyes wide in shock. "You? Who are you really?" "I am Feng Qinggu. I am the real Feng Qinggu." The weakened body trembled as a thought formed in her mind, her eyes filled with disbelief. Fair slender fingers gently tugged and the light veil covering slowly fell. A face of unparalleled beauty with delicate features was revealed and reflected in the young girl's widened eyes. When she saw the all-too-familiar countenance before her, the young girl was suddenly too shocked for words. The flawlessly beautiful face raised up slightly as she glanced at the shocking and terrifying-looking girl on the ground. Her voice was filled with endless anticipation and almost irrepressible excitement as she said, "Feng Qinggu, from today onwards, I will be taking over your identity, your status, and naturally everything you own entirely. As for you..." Her voice paused a moment and she gave a soft laugh. "As intelligent as you are, why don't you guess what would happen to you?" Hearing the person before her use her original voice to speak, Feng Qinggu froze a brief moment and she suddenly stared at the person before her and exclaimed, "Ruo! Ruo Yun! You are Su Ruo Yun." Su Ruo Yun was an orphan who had grown up together with her. She had picked her up from the streets and brought her back to the National Defense Mansion and kept the little orphan girl as her companion. The little girl had become a close friend whom she was able to talk to about everything under the sun, someone she had seen to be as close as a sister. So, she would never have thought that the person who had gotten her disfigured, who wanted to steal her identity, would turn out to be Ruo Yun. "Why? I treated you so well. Why are you doing this?" The pain of being betrayed sliced at her heart. When she thought of how her face had been disfigured, how her identity was about to be stolen, and they would all be unknown to anyone, a burning hatred began to pound from within her heart. "Why? Ha! Of course it's for everything that you possess. A grandfather and father that dotes and spoils you, a proud son of heaven that loves you to bits, and..." Her crescent smiling eyes looking at Feng Qinggu on the ground. "All this will soon belong to me. The indulgent pampering of a grandfather and father, the deep love and gentleness of Big Brother Murong, will all be mine. Chapter 2 Sold. You are listening at novelfull.audio. She was filled with a sense of satisfaction as she looked down at the duly tormented and wretched-looking Feng Qing-gu on the ground. However, she did not stop there and continued to say, "By right I should kill you here to prevent any future nightmares, and completely erase all traces of your body so that nobody will ever find you. But, ah ha ha." Hearing that viciousness in her laughter shook Feng Qing-gu visibly, and the demonic laugh sounded once more. "Do you know why I asked them to only specifically destroy your devastatingly good looks and not harm the snowy white skin on your body?" She bent down over slightly and looked into Feng Qing-ji's face and went on to say, "That is because I am going to sell you to a place which is most degrading, the type of place that offer pleasure to men. I believe even when you have been so monstrously disfigured, your snowy skin and smooth flesh should still be rather popular with them. What do you think? You don't need to look at me like that. Your beautiful face has already been destroyed. Even if you were to tell people you are the eldest miss of National Defense Mansion, nobody will believe a word of it and only call you a lunatic. Escape. Your power as a mere second-grade warrior wouldn't measure up to anything there." As she spoke, she shoved a pill into Feng Qing-ji's mouth and stood back up with a laugh. 7 days. If you manage to survive 7 days throughout your ordeal, the poison I just gave you will then kill you. Feng Qing-gu gritted her teeth in anger and screamed. "Su Ruoyun. Even as a ghost, I will never let you off. Ha, you can't even deal with me as a human now, you will be even more helpless as a ghost." She laughed chillingly and ordered the men. "Bring her away, make sure she is sold multiple times and do not leave a trace. It will be best that you silence the recipient." "Yes." The two burly men acknowledged respectfully and immediately delivered a chop onto Feng Qing-ji's back. They lifted Feng Qing-gu onto their shoulders and with a few leaps, they quickly disappeared into the trees. Standing behind Su Ruoyun all this while, was a middle-aged man dressed in full black who now took a step forward. "Young miss, it is getting late. Will you be returning to the mansion now?" "Yes, I should be getting back." She showed a gentle smile as she looked up into the skies and said softly, "From this moment on, I am Feng Qing-gu, and Feng Qing-gu is me." 2 days later. Night. Dalang City, Scented Sky House. Detecting a strong fragrance, the unconsciousness Feng Qing-gu opened her eyes. She was still immensely groggy when she heard a strange sound of someone's clicking tongue and feeling her arms being caressed by another pair of hands. She gave out a scream in fright and she rolled herself off the bed. "Heh heh. Awake already? That's great. Your master here does not like dead fish when I conduct my business. Your master here loves the lively and sprightly ones which taste better." A vulgar-looking man looking to be in his 30s was looking at her lustily through his beady eyes as Feng Qing-gu rolled to the ground and shrank back into a corner. The man's eyes were filled with excitement as he said, "I had not expected that they would give me something this great tonight. Although her face has been disfigured, but that unbelievably smooth flesh and fair skin, heh heh, it's comparable to those young miss from distinguished families." Feng Qing-gu shrank further back, her eyes filled with an unshakable panic. "You! Get away from me! Go away!" She stood up suddenly and ran towards the door, but she was grabbed into an embrace by the man after barely 2 steps. "Trying to run? Heh heh, once you entered this room, you think you can get away? Come! Let your master take a good look at your snow-white skin," the man said gleefully in excitement. His hand rose, tearing off the thin and light cloth sleeve from her clothes, and a whole arm's length of perfectly flawless skin was reflected in the man's eyes, and his eyes started to shine with a burning excitement. "Ah!" Feng Qing-gu screamed, as she felt her goose pimples rise from the disgust she felt from being embraced by the disgusting man. In her struggle to push the man away, her hands brushed over a dagger at his hip and without even thinking, she quickly pulled it out and thrust it right at the man's heart. Damn it. Slut. The man's lust had gone to his head and for a moment, he was slow in dodging and he got slashed across his chest. The pain caused him to push out and he flung Feng Qinggu away from him. Ah! Bam! Her head slammed into the corner of the bed and bright red blood flowed out like a spring. She tried to stand but her body swayed heavily and she fell back onto the ground, in a dead faint. Chapter 3 I am Feng Jiu. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Heavens be damned. The man looked at the blood oozing out from his chest and rage filled his mind as he lashed out with a hard kick to the abdomen of the motionless heap on the ground and he roared. Get up. Don't play dead with me. As he shouted, he grabbed at her clothes and lifted her limp body and threw her onto the bed. The excruciating pain in her head and abdomen made the initially unconscious person's face crease up in a deep frown. A voice was weeping noisily in her mind, further frustrating her with her already throbbing head. Shut up. She hollered loudly and at the same moment she opened her eyes, her brow pinched together. There really was a voice still sobbing in her mind, and before her eyes, there was a vulgar-looking man who had stripped himself all the way down to his underwear, currently eyeing her lustily. Her gaze swept past the vulgar-looking man and his equally disgusting body and saw that she was in a room filled with old Chinese vintage decor and her mouth turned into a hard straight line. In her mind, that weeping voice had after her shout, seemed to slowly subside and just finally stopped. So. You finally realized that playing dead doesn't work. Just be good and play with your lord here or else. I know of many ways to make sure you comply. Once he finished saying those words, he pounced like a hungry wolf on his prey as he leapt towards Feng Qinggu on the bed. You seek death. Her face filled with utter contempt, she shouted out and lifted her bent knee and lashed out her leg with a swift kick to send the vulgar-looking man flying. Crash. Oof. The vulgar man had taken a direct hit from that kick and he fell sprawled onto the floor landing on all fours like a toad, groaning in pain. He struggled to recover and stood up quickly, staring angrily at the girl sitting by the edge of the bed. He clenched his fist tight and threw a big punch. You dirty slut. You dare to kick me. I'll kill you. But, he was completely stunned when his punch thrown with his full strength was caught and without knowing how she did it, she grabbed the back of his hand and pulled back sharply. The sound of bones breaking cracked in the air, and the excruciating pain made him scream out almost losing his mind. A pair of cold hands suddenly closed around his neck and another crisp crack sounded. His head lolled to one side with his eyes bulging and he fell over like a limp doll. With death, not another sound came out from his mouth. Time seemed to stop at the moment as silence fell in the room. It was so quiet you would be able to hear a pin drop. At that moment, the girl sitting on the bed stretched out her fair slender fingers and she stared at them. Frowning slightly, a faint smile with a slight perverse tinge played across her lips. But that sinister smile when paired with her disfigured face, was chilling to see, whichever way you looked at it. The man who just died must have left instructions that no matter what happens in the room, no one was to come in. Hence, the two guards standing outside the room had not been bothered when they heard the loud crashes earlier, thinking that it was just the man torturing the girl. The young girl on the bed walked over to the bronze mirror and sat down. She looked at the abhorrent countenance reflected in the mirror and her eyes narrowed. She tapped her finger lightly on the top of the dressing table to elicit a soft knocking sound. Speak. Who are you? She asked staring into the mirror, as if talking to herself. And, just as she finished her question, a sobbing voice spoke at the back of her mind. I am Feng Qinggu. And who are you? Feng Jiu. She opened her mouth to say. I think you should already have died. Why have you left a sliver of your consciousness in my mind? I refuse to resign to my fate. My hatred for Su Ruoyun continues to burn. Su Ruoyun put me in this pitiable state. The sobbing voice was suddenly filled with hatred as it resounded within her mind. Feng Jiu remained silent, and did not say a single word for quite a while, only listening to the voice weep. The sobs were filled with resentment and hatred, and the raw emotions passed from her mind and crept into her heart, making her strongly feel an indignant rage that did not belong to her. Chapter 4 Melding of Memories. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Stop crying a moment and tell me all about it, she said with a frown, silently thinking to herself. If not for her the fact that she wanted to clear her doubts about this spectral presence in her mind and the situation before her, she would have walked out long ago, instead of sitting here to listen to the voice's incessant weeping. The voice in her head stopped a moment and the weeping was reduced to spasmodic sobs and sniffles. The voice did not share her story in great detail, as she was at least smart enough to realize what would serve her best interests best at that moment. Hence, she went to say, "I've died, and my body has now become yours. Feng Jiu, I will only beg for two things. First, I want Su Ruoyun to suffer a living fate worse than death. Killing her quickly with a thrust of the sword will not appease the hatred in the heart. And only when she lives, suffering endless torment, will the hatred be appeased and for my heart to rest in peace." Her voice had thick hatred wrapped around it. At that point, she already accepted that she wouldn't be able to recover anything for herself, and hence all she yearned for at that moment was to make the person responsible for putting her into that abominable state, that Su Ruoyun, to live out her life in endless suffering. Feng Jiu's eyebrow raised, but she did not speak. Only the ends of her mouth lifted slightly, but it was undeterminable whether that was a smile. And at that moment, as if knowing what Feng Jiu was thinking in her mind, Feng Qinggu continued to say, "I do not know where you came from, and I do not know what kind of status you held before. But from the cool-headed way you handled the situation and the calm I can sense from you, I believe you were someone extraordinary. Or at least, you will not be as dumb as I have been, to end up having someone steal your identity and ending killed in a dingy place like this." Upon hearing that, Feng Jiu's eyes lit up and the ends of her mouth lifted slightly higher, and she said, "Go on. What is the second one?" Hearing those words, Feng Qinggu knew that meant Feng Jiu has agreed, and she heaved a silent sigh of relief. But at the same time, her voice grew sorrowful and depressed. "My family members are all very kind people. They treasured me greatly and doted on me. I hope you can care for them on my behalf and do not let them know. Know that I am no longer around." The fair and snowy slender fingers tapped on the table softly. The light gentle tapping made Feng Qinggu nervous. She had no way of knowing what Feng Jiu was thinking, and left with no other choice, she feared hearing rejection coming out from Feng Jiu's mouth, so she went on to say, "I will leave all my memories to you to allow you to know everything that has happened. Feng Jiu, you must help me, you must help me." After hearing the voice in her head fade off, Feng Jiu suddenly felt an intense pain in her head, feeling just like someone was forcibly stuffing something into it. Her brows drew close together as she closed her eyes to endure the sharp pain, and it was a while later before she slowly opened her eyes. And in her mind, she suddenly found many memories that did not originally belong to her. It might be due to Feng Qingji's memories melding with hers, but when the memory of being disfigured surfaced in her mind, she could feel the same feelings Feng Qinggu had felt then, almost just like she had been the one who had actually suffered under that knife. Su Ruoyun. Haha. Interesting. The melding of memories in her mind had also allowed her to understand her current situation and what was going on around her. Hence, she stood up and walked over to the dead man's side, emptying the man's stripped-off clothes of anything that was of value. She saw that the dress on herself had a sleeve torn off and the front lapel was ripped. She quickly decided, and she tore out a piece of cloth from the inner layer of her skirt to hide her face. Her disfigured face would stand out too much, and if she wanted to leave this place, she needed to do it stealthily, without catching anyone's eye. Bove pity, a thorough search of the room had not given her any pieces of clothing she was able to wear. As for the man's clothes, she saw that they were really too dirty and she did not want to wear them. She suddenly remembered that this was a place where men seeked pleasure of the flesh, so she simply tore off the other sleeve and revealed her fair and smooth shoulders. She adjusted and fixed the dress further, quickly turning it into a tube dress as her gaze fell onto the light gauze draped over the bed frame. She reached out her hand and pulled the gauze over her shoulders before leaping out the window at the back. She landed firmly and her eyes quickly surveyed the surroundings but saw only one way out right before her. She snuck into the courtyard in front and blended in among the girls teasing and laughing there. Just as she was about to take a step to leave the place, a shrill scream rang out. "Ah! Someone's been murdered." Chapter 5: A Knife Across the Throat. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It has been exposed. Run. That was her first instinct and immediately ran towards the exit. However, a cold gleam flashed before her eyes and she sensed a terrifying and bloodthirsty chill speeding towards her. Seeing the cold gleam quickly closing in, she crouched down to dodge it without thinking. Swoosh! Arg! The cold sharp wind from the speeding blade passed just above her head. Her ears heard multiple gasps of shock and screams broke. Everyone was pushing and shoving in a terrified frenzy and Feng Jiu found that a big amount of space had been cleared around her. She lifted her head. With her in the middle of it all, a wave of people surrounding her were all dead with a blade wound that had severed their throats. I was lucky I dodged that one. She thanked the gods on this one and she was about to want to tiptoe away when a pair of black boots stopped right before her. A pair of eyes staring down at her flashed darkly a brief moment and she warily lifted her head, her body shaking. Wu! Standing before her was a man dressed in black. His face was covered behind a black scarf hiding his looks. But that pair of eyes were filled with a cruel and vicious glint, that drove fear and terror into the hearts of people. The sword he was holding in his hand was pointing to the ground and fresh red blood was still dripping from its point, drop by drop till it seemed like the ground had blossomed with red plums. Not knowing whether it was intentional, her trembling body caused the light gauze draped over her shoulders to fall onto the ground, exposing her snow-white shoulders and flawlessly smooth skin. Her face was veiled, but her enchanting eyes were brimming with tears, and matched with that slightly trembling slender form, she looked, oh so helpless and pitiful. The man in black was obviously not one who gave in to lust easily. Those cruel and vicious eyes had upon seeing that snowy smooth skin wavered just the slightest of moments, and they quickly shifted to stare at the mass of people who had retreated backwards against the wall, seemingly looking for something, and the hand holding the sword suddenly shifted slightly at that moment, preparing to get rid of the person before him who was in his way. The killer's intent grew stronger, filling the air, and Feng Jiu suddenly wailed frantically. Wu! Don't kill me! But, at the same moment she was standing up, her hand waved over her thigh and a dagger with a cold gleam was suddenly moving faster than sound towards the man's arm that was holding the sword. Sock! Clang! As he had not felt any murderous intent from the girl before him, he had gotten careless and had relaxed his guard against her. With the close proximity they were in then, his careless slip had caused his arm to be cut and a great amount of blood was flowing out. His arm trembled and the sword gripped in that hand fell heavily to the floor. As if by reflex, he immediately lashed out with a swift kick. That kick was imbued with an airstream and delivered with his internal force. Even people who cultivated would be hard-pressed to survive his kick, but against all his expectations, the kick he had aimed right at the girl's chest was dodged by her through some strange move she used with her body. With that brief momentary distraction, he next saw the girl leaping right at him, the dagger aimed right at his chest. He instinctively reached out his hand to neutralize the attack, but it turned out her charge was actually a feint. While that dagger was thrust out, her leg swiftly whipped and sped straight between the man's legs. Ung! A heart-rending pain tore through him as he groaned out in agony. His legs closed together involuntarily, putting him in a half-squat. That presented her with the greatest opportunity and she flipped the dagger in her hand in a reverse grip and sliced it across his throat. A knife across the throat. Killing with one move. Till his death, the black-masked man's eyes remained wide open, filled with resentment and rage, seemingly as if he refused to accept that he would die under the hands of a girl. The mass of people who had retreated far behind looked on in shock at the scene before their eyes, widened in utter disbelief. They couldn't believe that such a weak and gentle-looking girl who had been just wailing pitifully barely moments ago would suddenly transform into such a lethal god of death who executed flawlessly smooth and merciless critical strikes upon the black-robed man, killing him instantly with one quick move. Before any of them could recover, they saw that the girl had already run out with looking back once, and disappearing into the night. Chapter 6 The Man She First Me. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A small thin figure was squatting by an inconspicuous street corner yawning his head off. His half-closed eyes were looking at the patrolling teams roving on the bustling street as he pulled out an apple from within his clothes and began to take bites out of it in a big show of utter boredom. Dressed in beggar's rags, old, tattered and filthy, his dirty face was even well smeared with mud and grime, his hair wrapped within a broken rag, looking every inch a malnourished, skinny little beggar. Nobody would have guessed that the very one person who had so greatly angered the town's mayor as to make him order an all-out search for that woman from the brothel would be this little beggar by the street corner. What bad luck! How do I get out of here? Even if I have the patience to wait, the poison in my body wouldn't allow it. Taking bites out from the apple, Feng Jiu sighed softly. If she had known that the vulgar and disgusting man that she killed last night was the town mayor's only son, she would have at least let him live, and the mayor wouldn't have deployed all the guards to comb the entire town to search for her. But, who was that black-robed man then? Assassin. Remembering the energy that had surrounded that man's body when he executed his moves, she began to feel a little jittery. She had thought that after being reborn, she would at most just have to deal with living under the rule of some ancient dynasty. Who would have thought that the people here cultivated immortality? Immortal cultivation, that was something that entered the realm of fantasy. But thinking back to the fact that she, a person from the 21st century, had even been reborn into a god-damned place like this, made everything else seem not as strange anymore. Immortal cultivation. Then her whole arsenal of skills her body possessed would amount to naught before these cultivators of immortality. She flung the half-eaten apple away and sat there sighing to herself, dispirited. Until a crisp and clear sound rang out right before her. Clink. 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 The broken bowl before her suddenly had a tiny nugget of silver spinning in a circle within it before settling down in the middle. Feng Jiu stared blankly at the silver within the broken bowl and picked it up to inspect it. It felt not different from a common rock except that it was silver on the outside. She looked up and turned her head towards the person who had thrown the silver nugget into her bowl and saw the wide back of a person dressed in a black robe. He was walking slowly, his steps light but firm, and a chilling aura emanated from his entire being that drove people to stay away from him. With that turn of her head, without even thinking about it, she leapt up to grab at that man's leg, wailing pitifully in a loud voice. Woo-hoo! Brother-in-law! I've found you at last, oh my brother-in-law! The man suddenly dodged in a flash and she ended up grabbing at air and she fell forward from the forward momentum, scraping both her hands and groaning in pain. The black-robed man frowned, his sharp and penetrating gaze sweeping over the little beggar on the ground briefly, before he resumed his steps to continue striding forward. A single glance, and he was able to determine that the beggar on the ground was just a commoner that did not practice cultivation. Of course, Feng Jiu at that moment was just a common and ordinary person. The little bit of cultivation that her body's previous owner had achieved had been completely undone by the poison that Su Ruoyun had forced into her mouth, and she was now just an ordinary person who did not possess any cultivation powers. And it was exactly because of that when those cultivators of immortality saw her, an ordinary person who had no cultivation, would relax their guard against one such as her. Brother-in-law! Do not desert me! Wah! I suffered so much hardship before I managed to find brother-in-law. Brother-in-law! She got up and pounced once again, falling a few more times, until, the black-robed man in front finally stopped in his tracks. Brother-in-law. The chance was not to be missed. Feng Jiu clasped both her hands and feet to hug herself round the man's leg, clinging on tightly, as she raised her tear-brimmed eyes, injected with some timidness, to look at the man. And when she saw the man's countenance, her mouth suddenly developed an involuntary twitch. This leg she was clinging on to like a koala, might have been a mistake. Chapter 7 Sticking to him. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Looking at broad back, the man before her eyes stood out as a great example epitomizing what made a man. But when she saw his face, she only felt like slapping herself on the forehead to say with a long sigh. Come on. This is obviously the face of an aged uncle already in his 30s. The sharp-featured, stalwart and hard face was half covered in his beard and his face shape could hardly be made out just as was his countenance. Although the pair of eyes were endlessly deep and mysterious, but whichever way you chose to look at it, he was an uncle in his 30s, and he couldn't quite fit into the profile of being anything like her young Nubel-body's brother-in-law. But, she had no other choice in the matter before her and she was not going to let go of the leg she was latched onto, so she continued to cry out. Brother-in-law. Boo-hoo. I finally found you. Oh brother-in-law. Ling Mo Han's up-slanted brows creased together as he stared at the koala-like little beggar latched onto his leg. As he was unused to being touched, his entire body was currently completely frozen. He tried to shake the beggar off his leg and he gave a low holler. You've mistaken me for someone else. Let go. However, the little beggar was clinging on too tightly and he could not shake him off. Woo-hoo. Brother-in-law, I am not mistaken. My sister told me you had a great big beard. I saw you when I was very young and I will not mistake you for anyone else. Boo-hoo. Brother-in-law, don't drive me away, there is no one at home anymore and my stepmother wants to sell me off. Boo-hoo. Brother-in-law. I am not your brother-in-law. You've really got the wrong person. Ling Mo Han's expression was turning chilly and the chilling aura emanating from his being was intensifying terrifyingly. But the little beggar clinging onto his leg was not loosening his grip in the slightest. He shook his leg a few more times but he still failed to dislodge the person. When he stretched out his hand wanting to pick the little beggar off, he suddenly screamed and held on even tighter, his head even pushing against a sensitive area between his legs, and his body suddenly stiffened, his face darkening immediately. Let go. No way. Unless you agree to take me with you. She was stuck unabashedly onto the man's leg and completely unaware her head was pushing against the person's sensitive part, secretly celebrating in silent glee that although the aged uncle was a little cold in his demeanor, but fortunately, he was harsh only with his mouth and not in his actions, seemingly like he wouldn't use his powers on a commoner who did not practice cultivation. Noel valiantly suppressing the urge to kill, Ling Mo Han drew in a deep breath before he said. Let go. I'll let you come with me. Sniff. Brother-in-law, I knew you wouldn't desert me. She wiped at her dry eyes which had not been wet in the slightest and she quickly got to her feet. Seeing that the man had already turned and walked away, she immediately hurried to catch up. Seeing the distance between them being pulled apart, Feng Jiu's eyes flashed and smile curled up on her face. No wonder he had agreed for her to follow him so easily. So this was what he had planned to do, to leave her behind like this. Unfortunately for him, he had gravely miscalculated. There was no way she wouldn't be able to keep up with his pace. At the very least, before she manages set foot outside of this Dalang city, she needed to stick to him. This man was obviously not from a simple background and sticking by him would ensure that the guards will not dare to stop them. Brother-in-law. Wait up, I can't keep up. Brother-in-law. She ran slowly behind him and when she saw that he was going towards the city gates, her heart leapt with joy and she quickened her pace to catch up. Ling Mo Han's steps faltered, as he turned his head around slightly. He saw the little beggar's filthy little hand was tugging at a corner of his robe. He flicked his arm down to brush off the little beggar and he continued on with his wide strides forward. Brother-in-law. Brother-in-law, don't be angry with me, at most I won't pull at your clothes anymore. Brother-in-law. She jogged along as she cried out pitifully, noticing from out of the corner of her eyes that the guards at the city gates suddenly stiffened when they spotted the uncle in front of her, and lowering their heads to bow in subservience. The guards who had been marching straight towards her suddenly froze in their spots when they heard her address the man as brother-in-law, their faces greatly puzzled as they discreetly assessed the two people. Chapter 8. That's called an uncle. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Brother-in-law, where are we going? After coming out through the city gates, she started sizing up the people around. At that moment, Ling Mo Han stopped his steps and glanced at the little beggar to say in a deep voice. You're already out here, don't follow me anymore. Feng Jiu was startled a moment and she quickly continued on to say with a sweet smile. Oh brother-in-law. What are you saying? The uncle had actually been aware that she wanted to come out through the city gates. That was to be expected now that she thought about it, as the man did not look to be from common stock and her petty tricks should have been pretty obvious to him. But what surprised her was that he still helped her even after being wise to her chicanery. Seeing him walking away quickly with wide strides, Feng Jiu hastened to catch up. Brother-in. Before she could finish her words, she was interrupted. I am not your brother-in-law, stop addressing me that way. The deep voice was a deep baritone, cold and hard, the very personification of masculinity. Have I really mistaken you for someone else? My sister told me my brother-in-law has a really bushy beard, is easily recognizable. She jogged alongside him and began to scrutinize him carefully from head to toe. Suddenly, she grinned widely and said. Heh, maybe, just maybe, I might have really gotten the wrong guy. You see, my brother-in-law should be a tad bit younger than you. Ling Mo Han continued on his way, completely ignoring the little beggar at his side. From the way he looked at it, a little beggar with some smarts but did not practice any cultivation in the slightest did not deserve his attention, and hence, he quickened his steps forward, a few times faster than he had been in the city. In regards to his suddenly increased speed, Feng Jiu was suddenly intrigued as she thought to herself. Watching his steps, they seemed to tread lightly upon the ground, but at the same time, they seemed to just flit across without touching. He was moving extremely quickly, but it was quite different from her own traceless on snow cloud treading steps. Uncle. Uncle. Wait for me. It wasn't that she really wanted to stick to him, but there was only one road after coming out through the city gates. Moreover, she really couldn't afford to dilly-dally to follow that man around, as she needed to go find some herbs to counter the poison within her body. Remembering that fact only reminded her of the fact that Su Ruoyun wasn't just malicious. Despite her body's original owner having treated Su Ruoyun exceptionally well, Su Ruoyun had not only robbed her of her identity, Su Ruoyun had even sold her to a brothel for her to be tormented and humiliated to her death. TSK, this woman was really more venomous than a scorpion. But, according to the original Feng Qingji's memories, this Su Ruoyun seemed to have been just like her, having come from the 21st century as well. And she must be well versed in medicine as well, or she wouldn't have been able to create a mask that looked exactly like her. The more she thought about it, the more excited she became. Something that she had initially felt to be endlessly dull seemed to be getting more and more interesting. When Ling Mo Han, who was a distance further up front, heard the repeated shouts of uncle, a corner of his mouth began to twitch. He subconsciously felt the beard on his own face and he increased his pace another notch, thinking to ditch the person behind him. However, after about 4 hours, when he stopped and turned his head behind to peek, he saw the thin figure still following behind him about 10 steps away, and his heart was rather shocked. For someone who had not done a sliver of cultivation, how did he manage to keep up with him? Feng Jiu was panting heavily as she ran up to him, her back bent over with her hands resting on her knees, wheezing. Phew! That was so tiring, I'm ready to drop. Uncle! Why were you walking so fast? Ling Emohan brows creased up closer as he sized up the filthy little beggar for a long while before he said in a deep voice. Do not follow me anymore. The place I am headed to is the 9 Entrapment Woods. That place is filled with endless dangers and you will only be killed if you go in there. You've got it wrong, uncle. I wasn't following you, but it was originally my intention to go to the 9 Entrapment Woods anyway. But since you are going there too, isn't it better if we go there together? Chapter 9 Into the 9 Entrapment Woods. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ling Emohan completely ignored the person behind him and just widened his strides to continue walking. He was thinking that the little beggar was actually some young master from some rich family who had secretly run away for fun. From the moment the little beggar had latched onto his leg, he had not sensed the lowly humility from the beggar, and he had a pair of eyes that showed wit and were sharp, astute, nothing like what a beggar would have. After hearing that he was intending to go to the 9 Entrapment Woods, he was even more certain that the youth was just going there for nothing more than fun. If the youth really did not fear death and followed him blindly into the 9 Entrapment Woods, he would not be a busybody to go save him if anything happened. Seeing that the uncle in front was ignoring her, Feng Jiu did not say another word after that, but just jogged to keep up a few steps behind. However, if one were to look a little closer, they would notice that her steps were a little queer, as the speed she was moving at wasn't slower than Ling Emohan before her by much. The two of them moved one behind the other. Ling Emohan in the front did not once stop for any rest, and neither did Feng Jiu behind him. As time was running out, she needed to get to the 9 Entrapment Woods to find the necessary herbs to dispel the poison within her body, or her life would really end senselessly in this world just like that. But this body had after all once belonged to a young miss of a rich family. After running for a whole day and night without any food and drink, the body had reached its limits. Her legs were sore and heavy, her strides gradually slowing down, and the figure of Ling Emohan in front was getting further and further away from her. However, she still managed to come to the edge of the 9 Entrapment Woods at the break of dawn the next day, and she did not see any sign of the uncle anywhere. Phew! I'm bushed. She crashed back down onto the ground, panting heavily. Sweat ran in rivulets, and she was starving. She was feeling a little lightheaded and rather nauseous. From yesterday till now, the only thing she had was the apple that she had swiped from the fruit stall and that had long been digested, and not even the juice was left. Her stomach was ravenously empty and she wished endlessly for a scrumptious chicken leg to eat at that moment. She rested a while to catch her breath, and after wiping off her perspiration, she stood up and stared at the 9 Entrapment Woods before her, a smile of anticipation showing on her face. Hee. I should be able to catch myself some wild meat in the 9 Entrapment Woods. Just thinking about it made her swallow with a big gulp, and she immediately moved her feet to go into the woods. The trees were dense and the vegetation abundant. The sun's ray from above her head were half shielded, and the damp smell of the dirt and the fragrance of grass wafted past her nose, carried by the light breeze. Feng Jiu held a sprig broken off from one of the tree and swept it left and right before her as she walked. By doing that, she could on one hand, sweep away some of the weeds in her path, and on the other hand, drive away any venomous snakes that might be hiding in the grass. Her progress was slow, as her eyes carefully scanned for any herbs covered under the weeds. She had studied the poison in her body, and it might be difficult for others to undo, but for someone like her who was highly skilled in medicine and poisons, it was relatively easy. Of course, it was on the premise that she must first find the herbs she needed, or even if she was a medical deity, she wouldn't be able to undo the poison in her body with nothing. Perhaps it was because she was still on the outer edge. Although she had managed to find some herbs, they were all of the more common variety. And as for the wild fare that she was salivating from, it was almost utterly hopeless. Even after having walked for more than an hour, she had not seen a single sign of an edible live animal, but only quite a number of lizards rested upon the branches of the trees. She was so hungry it was making her feel weak. She saw some edible creeping wood sorrel herb growing among the weeds and she picked out a big bunch of them and chewed on them as she walked. Although the stem of the herb was sour, its flowers tasted lightly fragrant. It might not be much, but it was nevertheless better than her well-emptied stomach. Hey! I can actually find tree root berries here. She ran over in pleasant surprise when she saw the herb growing at the foot of the tree, which was one of the herbs she was seeking for on this trip for her antidote. Chapter 10 Gathering Herbs Alone. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Biting off the last leaves from the bunch of herbs she held in her hand, she threw the stems away to the side. Carefully digging out the tree root berry from the dirt at the base of the tree, she was squatting on the ground focused on the task, and she failed to notice that a black and white venomous snake was slithering through the grass towards her. As the snake neared her, its long body pushed its head up and it spat out its forked tongue, hissing softly. At that moment, the venomous snake struck, its jaw widened to bite onto Feng Jiu's calf. A sudden change came over Feng Jiu's expression and an austere murderous chill pervaded her entire being, her eyes suddenly turned bitingly cold. Her body pivoted lightning quick as her hand grasped onto the snake's head, the other hand clasped around the snake's 7-inch vital point. Her fingers tightened and with a snap, the fingers grasping the 7-inch vital point were driven deep into the snake's body. Hiss. The snake let out a loud hiss and its body spasmed before it fell limp. Oh! A silver ringed snake. The chillingly cold aura from just a moment before now felt like it had just been a momentary hallucination. She had immediately reverted right back to her appearance of languid laziness as she eyed the snake and laughed. I haven't seen any boars and not even a tiny rabbit. You will have to do for the time being when I roast you to fill my empty stomach. But, as she finished her statement, the smile on her face froze. She had just discovered one big problem. No fire. Under these damp and highly humid trees, starting a fire through friction would not be easy at all. She didn't have matches with her and not even a flintstone or stick of ember, she wouldn't be able to have roast snake after all. Forget it. Forget it. Just hold out for a little while more. I will have to at least find a drier place before I think of some way to start a fire. She mumbled to herself in a low voice in regret as she held the snake carcass in her hand thinking it would be such a waste to just throw the snake away. So, she proceeded to clean and process the meat. She first cut the head off, then skinned it, before removing the snake gall. She then hung the now unidentifiable piece of meat on a tree branch and wiped her blood-drenched hand on the grass. She picked some stronger-smelling plants and rubbed her hands vigorously with them to remove the stench of blood from them before carrying on with her search. So, on this day in the woods, a filthy little beggar dressed in ragged clothes could be seen walking alone within this danger-filled 9-entrapment woods, with a tree branch over his shoulder, and a skinned snake dangling from it as he skipped along. Throughout the entire day, she traversed alone within, searching for herbs to dispel the poison from her body. She had unknowingly walked from the outer edges of the woods to go deep into the inner reaches, and she was finally able to locate all the herbs she needed before dusk. Taking advantage of the remaining light that allowed her to still see, she found a dry branch and embarked on the most primitive way of starting a fire. But as the environment was damp and wet, she spent almost 2 hours tirelessly before she succeeded in starting the fire. Her hands had blistered badly from her efforts, but when she sank her teeth into the roasted snake meat, everything she did suddenly seemed all worth it. Having found all the herbs she needed for the antidote, and her stomach filled, she proceeded to mash up the herbs she found in the afternoon and applied it on her body. Then she extinguished the fire and climbed up a tall tree, to find a comfortable spot for her to get a good night's rest. Being in a place like this, and all alone, she could not afford to keep the fire burning. If not, when night fell, she could easily become the target of wild beasts, and she wasn't exactly brimming with energy at that moment to take them on. So, even when the branches high up in the trees were cold and she did not have the fire to warm her, she would choose safety over comfort without a thought. Diovico as expected, as the darkness fell, the howling of wolves reached her ears ringing through the woods, reverberating chillingly in the darkness, that drove fear into the hearts of men. As for Fengjiu, her eyes were closed as she had fallen into a deep sleep, seemingly treating the long ringing howls in the woods as her night-time lullaby. Naturally, she would also not notice that high up upon a tree not too far away, a dark shadowy figure had observed her every single action in this very dangerous woods.